first question is, how did you become interested in Shakespeare and what inspired you to study his work?
So I think there are two kinds of academic in my experience. One is the person who knows absolutely everything about quite a small thing that not many other people know about. And that was not a kind of academic I ever thought I would be good at being, partly because I'm quite sociable and I like to learn about things and enjoy things through talking with other people about them. And I think so I wanted to be the second kind of academic in a way, who knows a little bit about a huge topic where there are loads and loads of people working on it in different ways. And you've always got people to talk to and to talk with rather than talk at about it. So I love the fact about Shakespeare that, you know, people are studying it at school, people are putting on new productions of the plays or adapting the scripts to make films or to make other artworks or novels or, you know, whatever. It's a really alive topic for me, and the fact that I can never know everything about it is really what got me into it.
So you were probably the expert on Shakespeare. So I've got a few questions now about Shakespeare's life and his plays. So one student asked, why is Shakespeare still studied and performed today? And what do you think makes his work so enduring?
I think people would have a different answer to that. My answer is that Shakespeare's works are in some way incomplete. That's to say, they need us to make them make sense, to fill up questions, to provide our own interpretations. And I've talked about this as a kind of quality of gappiness. They've got space in them, and that space is, we can make a space for ourselves and our own interpretations. And I think that's why the plays have continued, and it's why they have been able to be done in so many different ways, different periods, different costumes with different interpretations. There is something about the quality of the plays which demands that. Whereas if you were to look at a playwright like Ben Jonson, who's a very brilliant, clever playwright, and there are some really amazing plays by him, but they don't have that capacity to make space, I think, for the kinds of viewers and readers that Ben Jonson himself could never imagine, whereas Shakespeare somehow has been able to do that.
Yeah. So even though Shakespeare's plays are still being performed kind of 400 years after they were first put on, I think a lot of students are maybe still wary of Shakespeare. So are there any ways to make his plays kind of more accessible and engaging for young people who may be put off by the language or themes?
So I think there are lots of ways to think about Shakespeare, depending on sort of what you're interested in. So you can think about Shakespeare almost as a kind of filmmaker, or as a theatre maker. You can think about Shakespeare as a poet. And these would all have different ways of approaching him. You know, you might want to be thinking about the arc of the story or the kind of visual impact of the plays, or you might be very much all about, you know, the poetry and the language. I'm a big fan of Shakespeare performed, although I do think there can be quite boring productions of Shakespeare. So I like a performance or a production which is quite bold in a way and has its own interpretation, and especially one that cuts. So that makes the plays are too long. I think everybody would agree with that. They're too long, and it's better to have them cut. So I would really encourage people to look around on YouTube and have a sense of different kind of productions. And the other thing I would think, if you're studying Shakespeare, is most of us are not reading Shakespeare thinking, ooh, I wonder what happens. It's kind of pretty obvious what's happening. If there's a man on his own, he's going to die. And if there's a woman dressed as a man, she's going to get married, and you know, those kinds of things. So we're not reading it for the like a detective story to think, oh, I wonder how it's all going to work out. And I think that means it's good to have a sort of synopsis or something, you know, a summary of what's happening, and maybe not even to start at the beginning. Often the beginning is not the most interesting place. So you can think, yeah, where have we got to now? And let's just go in right at the most interesting bit and kind of focus there. I think sometimes if you start at the beginning and work your way through, you've already exhausted by the time you get to the interesting bits.
Yeah, that seems good advice. I've never not started to play at the beginning, but I think that's an interesting way to think about it. And obviously, a lot of students are kind of studying Shakespeare because they have to. So one student asked, kind of, when analysing Shakespeare's works, what are some of the most important things to look for, or what would you find most interesting when you're kind of looking at a play?
So I think Shakespeare's language is a kind of poetic language which always has more than one meaning going on. And I don't think when we analyze it, we're supposed to work out which is the most important meaning, or to sort of smooth that out. I think when we're analyzing it, we're always trying to say, well, it could be this, or it could be that, or this word could suggest something negative, but it's also got a kind of positive energy as well. So the most important thing, I think, when analyzing is to bring out the quality of uncertainty, ambiguity, the kind of possibility that there could be more than one way to read or to understand or to deliver the lines. If you sometimes just trying out lines, in a cross voice or an angry voice or a wheedling voice or a kind of sarcastic voice, you get a sense, okay, yeah, that could work, that could be a reading, or maybe no, that doesn't work quite so well.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And so obviously a lot of students are studying Shakespeare, and I think a lot of them in particular are studying Macbeth. That's one of the plays on their curriculum. So I've got a few questions about that play in particular. So one question was, what do you think is the most important theme in Macbeth? Which is probably a question that you could spend hours talking about, but just...
Yeah, so in a way, my previous answer would suggest it's quite hard to say here is the most important theme, because that's a kind of unitary or single reading, and what I'm trying to say is there's always more than one reading. So I think there are lots of important themes in the play. One is the sort of the extent of sort of free will, who's to blame, whose responsibility is what happens. There's a theme, isn't there, about kinds of masculinity. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a good man or a bad man? Other ways of thinking about that the play works with. There's an important theme about women's role in men's lives and in political life, and I think there is a theme about the sort of nation. We're probably more interested in that now that Scotland is more prominent as a nation, or we're less complacent, we're less convinced that the United Kingdom will continue. So there's a kind of politics to it as well. So I think all of those are potential themes that you could find interesting and write and find examples of throughout the play.
And sticking with Macbeth, one of the most kind of prominent characters is Lady Macbeth. So one student asked, how do modern perceptions of Lady Macbeth differ to those of an audience in Shakespeare's time? Why is her character kind of so significant?
That's a really, really interesting question. And it's a difficult question because we actually don't know how audiences would have reacted to Lady Macbeth. We might assume that audiences in Shakespeare's time were more perhaps more limited or more prejudiced in what they thought of as women's, the role of women in society. But they had just had a very powerful Queen Elizabeth, for decades. There were models of powerful women. So I don't think we should necessarily assume that people in the past thought in a particular way and thought in a way which was less imaginative or less progressive than us. And obviously, maybe it's obvious, maybe it's not. If there are women in the audience of the play, do they feel differently about Lady Macbeth from the way men might? If you go to a movie now with your friends, quite often you'll come out and have a different view of it anyway. So the audience is never probably going to be homogenous. I think what we are interested in now is maybe motivation. Why does Lady Macbeth behave as she does? And one very prominent motif in productions of the play has been to suggest that there is a sort of trauma in the marriage of the Macbeths, and that's to do with children, with the loss of children or with infertility or something. Lady Macbeth says that she knows what it's like to have given suck, so to have breastfed a baby, but there isn't a child there, and there's a lot of angst about the fact that there is no heir to the Macbeths. So I think we have become more interested in thinking not just that she is a two-dimensional character, but that perhaps she has some kind of a psychology that we are only given a little tiny glimpse of in the play, and that we need to sort of work hard to understand. So I think there's more of an attempt to understand her, and quite a lot of retellings of the play have organized themselves around a sort of a Lady Macbeth who's more perhaps just even more likable or more understandable, and less monstrous, or less aligned with the witches, maybe, which is one of the ways of thinking about the play.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you. And one final question on Macbeth, which I suppose kind of is maybe linking slightly with what you just talked about, but how significant is the context in which Macbeth was written to understanding the play itself?
Yeah, so in a way, the context is a really interesting way to think about this play, and I want to talk about that, but I don't want to forget the fact that the reason that you're still having to study Macbeth is that in some way that context doesn't really matter. There are ways of updating the play or thinking about it as a play in 2023 which have left that long behind. But part of the context that I have found really important, actually, for thinking about Macbeth, is the gunpowder plot. So the gunpowder plot is the origin of the bonfire night celebrations on the 5th of November. And it celebrates the failed plot by Catholics to blow up the Houses of Parliament when the King James, was coming to visit them. And the plot was foiled, the explosion never happened, the king was not assassinated, and there was a big sort of show trial, a lot of anti-Catholic feeling around the show trial. And it's in the aftermath of that that Shakespeare writes Macbeth. And what's so interesting to me about that is we could think about the gunpowder plot as effectively an act of terrorism, or an attempted act of domestic terrorism. It's not one state against another. In fact, it's radical members of a religion who want to strike terror and show their power in a sort of soft, as it were, quite a soft target. So terrorism is something which is very familiar to us. It was very familiar to Shakespeare's London as well. But what's interesting to me is that Shakespeare really tries to understand what's it like to be one of those murderers of the king, or would-be murderers of the king. He goes really deep into Macbeth's mind and into the guilt and the consequences that Macbeth experiences after he's murdered Duncan. And that seems to me quite a radical way to respond. Even now, I think we're quite often told that we shouldn't, we should condemn terrorism, not understand it. We shouldn't think of what it's like to be that person. We should instead just completely banish it, really, from our humanity. And Shakespeare doesn't do that, and instead he wants to go deep into this very troubled psychology of Macbeth himself. So that feels to me a really interesting context for the play. But as I said, I mean, there are other ways in which sometimes the context, I think, can be a little bit misleading. Lots of people who read Macbeth assume that everybody in Shakespeare's time believed in witches, believed that they were real, powerful people around. And that's like saying, everybody who watches Buffy believes in vampires. Of course we don't. We sort of do for the fiction, but we don't in real life. And audiences were perfectly capable of that kind of double vision as well. So sometimes I think we overuse the context to suggest that Shakespeare's plays are more historically accurate, when really they're entertainment pieces. They play with reality. They're not documentaries. They don't just demonstrate it. And there was one, sorry, I'm going on now, I know, but there's one last thing I wanted to say, which was, of course, as well, Shakespeare's plays are always finding new contexts and new ways of being relevant. So they have left behind in lots of ways the things that made them important in the Shakespearean period, and they've gathered new things. Like, for example, I mean, we're very interested, aren't we, in sort of forms of masculinity, so-called toxic masculinity. Thinking about that, we're interested in what happens to soldiers and military veterans when they come back from war. How do they get reabsorbed into the peacetime world? How does trauma work? These have been lots of contexts, much more modern contexts for Macbeth.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to kind of finish off, I have one more question about lots of the students watching this will be thinking about maybe studying English at university. So what advice do you have for students who are kind of interested in studying English at university? What kind of skills should they be working on, and how can they acquire those?
So I think it'd be fabulous to think really hard about doing English at university. It's a really versatile subject, which leads to interesting and well-rewarded careers in all kinds of fields. You don't just become an English teacher or a sort of failed novelist or something. I've got students who are lawyers, who are journalists, who are work in advertising or in kind of management consultancy, in all kinds of roles, as well as in more, as it were, sort of conventional Englishy kind of disciplines. So really think about it. And the main thing that people are looking for, if you're applying to do an English degree, is that you actually like reading, and that reading is something that you spend a bit of your own leisure time doing. You don't just do when you're made to do it at school. It doesn't really matter what you read, so long as you've got the appetite to read, different kinds of things. But if what you really read at the moment is, science fiction or graphic novels or something like that, that's fantastic. You can have a really good conversation about that. So reading is the first thing. And then I think the second thing you need if you want to study English is that you enjoy sort of debating ideas and hearing other people's perspectives. I think if you prefer to do your reading sort of on your own, and you don't really want to discuss with other people, and that's not part of the pleasure of it for you, then it's probably not the right degree for you. But if you do enjoy that, then you find that English is a subject which includes history and politics, and sometimes includes economics and psychology and sociology, and all kinds of other subjects that you might think of as being quite separate. It's a big greedy subject, English. It sucks in lots of different things into it. So I hope some people listening to this are interested in pursuing English at university. It's much better than doing it at GCSE, let's say that. Because if you feel a bit at GCSE, there are things that you've got to say in order to get good marks, and that there's a slight feeling that it's already a bit sort of prescribed for you or prescripted for you. I know lots of people who feel a bit like that about GCSE, including some people who teach GCSE English. That's not at all what doing at university is like. We're much more interested in your opinions and what you think is important about the texts and how you make an argument about that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think that's all the time we've got, but thank you so much for answering our questions. It's really appreciated.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thanks to everybody who sent in questions.